Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm just back from the Psychotronics conference in Chicago. I may seem a little weary. I just flew in back to Albuquerque just a few hours ago, so well, it's been a little tiring, but it was an exciting event, and there are some things I'd like to share with you about radionics. Now, let me start by saying this. You can read a bit about radionics in The Roots of Consciousness, and I'm linking now to the page. It has to do with folklore in The Roots of Consciousness, folklore relating to healing, but my mentor, Arthur M. Young, who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter, was a big enthusiast of radionics. You know, after he invented the Model 47, the very first commercially licensed helicopter that was released in 1947, he began an exploration of all sorts of fringe phenomena, and he wasn't really restricting himself by popular belief, because if people thought something was quackery, and radionics has been widely viewed as quackery, that didn't stop him from making his own investigations. And he was convinced that even though the radionics machines seemed to have no logical basis that he could figure out, I mean, there were wires inside of these machines that weren't even connected, he thought it was quite legitimate. Although he really thought it was like a training wheels. He studied radionics practitioners like Ruth Drown and Frances Farrelly. Frances Farrelly, in particular, widely respected for her work in radionics, but she claimed eventually that the radionics devices were like training wheels, and after she learned to work with the device, then she could perform the same sorts of functions without it. But I think what this is for some people who might have latent psychokinetic abilities. However, they don't trust themselves enough. And if they're told, well, there's a scientific basis to all of this, you're not really doing it. It has to do with Pythagorean mathematical relationships and Tesla scalar waves and other things, so they don't have to feel responsible for it, then it seems to work well for individuals like this. Arthur Young once described to me, and it's not in the book, but he described this, an experiment he did where radionics was used to rid a crop of pests. And the radionics practitioners took a photograph of that crop, and he marked every other row. I don't know, maybe it was alfalfa, for example. And he, according to Arthur Young, who said he investigated this, was able to eliminate pests, insects, from every other row of this field using the radionics instrument. And you'll read in The Roots of Consciousness, if you read that section, about Ruth Drown and her camera and Arthur Young's test of the camera. Well, the camera worked without light at all. She put film inside of a black box. He had a toothache, and when the film was developed, there was a picture of his tooth. Now, as I say, no lenses, no light. And then he decided to test it again. He used his finger. He pressed on his tooth. And when they took the next photo, it was an enlargement of the same tooth. When he pressed on it, of course, because he had a toothache, the pain increased. Well, those things impressed him a lot. And at the Radionics conference, I call it the Radionics conference, it was the Psychotronics conference. And at that conference, there were many different vendors of radionics devices and radionics equipment, and all modern, computerized, the latest updated equipment. It was quite impressive. I'm going to show you some photographs of some of this equipment to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. It really has the veneer of something very scientific, very technological, but the way it's used is, I think it's actually like a recipe for a magical ritual with the trappings of science. Now, I happened to sit at a luncheon table just yesterday with a fellow who told me he was an engineer and he happened on a radionics device. Somebody sent it to him because they said they found it in the attic or something and didn't know what to do with it. And he's an engineer, and they sent it to him, and he began studying it to see what it was all about. I can tell you that the history of radionics goes back about 100 years. The field was basically, the founder is said to be Dr. Albert Abrams, who was a professor of medicine at Stanford University. And even though today it's largely regarded as quackery, Abrams himself was a highly credentialed individual. Now, this engineer who sat next to me at lunch wasn't a vendor. He was just sharing with me his own personal experiences. And he said he learned by contacting the various radionics associations. They have conferences, I think, every year in Rapid City, South Dakota. And he attended those conferences and began to get training in the use of the device and had a mentor with whom he worked. And he told me that he used it actually to recover money that was owed to him. Somebody had borrowed a large sum of money from him, and after 10 years, the fellow hadn't paid him back, but in the meantime had bought himself a new car and a new house and seemed to be prospering. And so he used, you could say he engaged in a magical ritual, really, to get the money back. But it was all done with radionics equipment and, as I say, the veneer of science and technology. And the idea is you find just the right frequency to solve the problem that you need. You use the radionics equipment to broadcast that frequency or to charge objects with that frequency. So radionics practitioners will sell a variety of jewelry supposedly charged with different frequencies that are used for different purposes. Now, he did this. His mentor said, yes, you can do this. And he developed a frequency broadcasting to the man who owed him money. And within a few days, I think he said for the first time, it took 2 weeks. And the fellow who owed him the money called him up and he said, I've been feeling really guilty. I haven't paid you back for so long. He said, I couldn't sleep all last night because of it. I felt so guilty, and I want to start making monthly payments. And the monthly payments came in, and it was quite satisfactory. But after about 4 months, the monthly payments stopped. And so now, according to the gentleman who sat with me at the luncheon table, he said that what had happened was he decided to use the radionics device for something else. And in the setup that he had only enabled him to work on one project at a time. And so he had stopped focusing the frequency on this individual. So consulting with his mentor, he switched over again and began with the radionics device transmitting the psychokinetic frequency. That's what I'll call it, because I think it's really psychokinesis. And the radionics device was again tuned to this individual who owed money. And within a couple of days, he called again and he said, I couldn't sleep again. I'm so sorry I missed the payment. I'm just going to send you the entire amount of money I owe you all at once. And that happened. So here's what I have to say. To the best of my knowledge, that information that I have just shared with you really belongs in the category of folklore, because it wasn't well attested. It was one person's account to me of his experience. I have no reason to disbelieve him, but on the other hand, I can't say that it was the sort of thing that would stand up in a courtroom. It's certainly not the sort of thing that was tested in a double-blind scientific experiment, but I do think that it suggests to me people should be looking into this. probably there are, I would imagine that if you dug into it, you would find a few scientific studies, because I know there are various credentialed doctors who are using this. It supposedly can heal a wide variety of conditions, as well as all sorts of other psychokinetic projects. I wouldn't be surprised if people use it for weather control and who knows what else, because there are several companies manufacturing these devices. To the best of my knowledge, there must be hundreds of practitioners, and I'll bet you could find in various sources, different books and scientific studies. As far as Abrams, who was, as I say, a Stanford University professor, he died in 1924, incidentally. I would imagine if one dug back historically, one would find some scientific studies. Surely a Stanford University professor would have wanted that. Although the state of the art of science back in the 1920s was not at all what it is today. So I'm sharing this with you because I think that it's very interesting that if you put the trappings of modern science on top of ancient magical practices in today's environment, where the scientists are, you might say, the high priests of our culture, that it has a kind of, you could call it a hypnotic effect or a social, cultural effect, that there's a category of individuals, maybe typically people who are trained as engineers and scientists, who are not going to feel comfortable doing something if they thought it was simply a magical ritual, but if at least it has the trappings of science, that it enables them to feel emotionally comfortable and, to my way of thinking, activates their psychokinesis. Now, of course, this is all speculative, but what does this mean for you? I guess the question you might wish to ask yourself is that would you feel more comfortable performing healings, performing actions, causing things to manifest in the universe if you were under the impression that you were following a scientific protocol? Would that make a difference to you? I think for many people, in fact, it would. I don't think radionics is for everybody, but it does seem from the reports that I have been hearing that for certain individuals, nerds, you might say, nerdy types of people, that this is a pathway to opening up latent abilities. And perhaps, like Francis Farrelly, you will graduate to the point where you don't really need the equipment any longer, the training wheels, so to speak. But maybe not. I think for some people, they're comfortable with this equipment and they stick with it. And probably, like almost everything in the field of parapsychology and the behavioral sciences in general, it will be statistical. It won't work 100% of the time. It may work 60, 70, 80% of the time, which isn't bad at all. So give it some thought, and once again, thank you for being with me.